We've added the ability to create tracks. Now we want to introduce the concept of users so that we can authenticate users visiting our application, and we can also associate user data with the tracks that are created. However, instead of creating a users app, just like we did for tracks, instead of running the start app command, we're just going to create a user folder on the same level as tracks and manage.py. Our users folder is going to contain just one file, and it's going to be schema.py. So we're going to create this schema file to be able to do two things. First, create new users with the help of a GraphQL mutation, as well as have the ability to query for an individual user based on their ID. We don't need to create a separate users app because out of the box, Django already provides to us a pre-made user model, a very robust user model. So to get access to it, all we need to do is say from django.contrib.auth import get user model. And just like we did for our tracks, we're going to create, like we did for track type, if we head to schema.py and tracks, just like we did for track type, we're going to pass to this inner meta class our model, which will be set to the user model. Before we do that, we'll need to import Graphene, and then from Graphene Django import Django object type to create this particular class. And we'll say class user type, subclasses from Django object type, and then to the inner meta class, our model is going to be set to the executed get user model. So this is how we get access to the user model. And our first step is to create a mutation for creating a new user. So we'll make a create user class where it's going to return a user to us, a created user. So we'll make that field called user, set to graphene.field, and pass in the user type that we just made. And the arguments necessary to make a new user, which we put on our arguments class, are going to be username, which will be in the form of a string, password, which will also be a string, and email, also a string. Now when we execute this create user mutation, we want to make all three of these arguments required. To create a user, we have to have all three of these fields. They can't be empty. So within string, we'll set the required argument to true to make that the case. Then for our mutate function, it'll take self, info, username, password, and email. And we're going to create a new user, once again with the executed get user model. And once we have this model, you can basically treat it like this. Once we have our user model, we can create a new user by passing in the arguments username and email. And from this operation, we'll get returned to us a user, which we'll put in a user variable. To include our password, we need to use a separate operation called set password that's provided on our created user. So we'll pass our password argument to it. Then to save it, we can use user.save. Once again, we'll need to create our mutation class. And add our create user mutation, so to create user.field. Then we'll head back to app schema.py. Now we need to import the schema in users.schema, and to our base mutation class we pass in users.schema.mutation. So let's save these files and make sure our server is running. We'll head back to graphical, we'll refresh, we'll take a look at the mutations. We should have this new create user mutation. And if we take a look at create user, we have our user field returned from it, and it's of type user type. And there's a ton of fields that we can get it, a ton of fields that were provided by our user model. Note that many of these fields won't apply to us. For example, the is super user field won't be relevant. So if you want to restrict this user type to a certain set of fields, you want to exclude some, you can head back to users schema.py, and on user type, we can add this only fields attribute, which enables us to specify exactly the fields that we want included on the user type. So say we only wanted to include ID and email, password, username, only the things that were strictly necessary, and we saved it and refreshed. When we visit the user type, we only have access to those fields that we specified. So it's worthwhile to note this only fields attribute. However, I'm going to remove it. There are some values that are worth exploring. For example, we could use information like date joined. Some of this stuff is of some value. Regardless, let's write our create user mutation. And on it, we need to specify our username, email, and password. So we'll say read password, read the email, read@yahoo.com. And then all of our return data is going to be on a user field. And we'll grab ID, password, username, email, and date joined. We'll execute this. And hopefully you caught my error here. The error is that I forgot to return create user with our user field at the end. We'll return create user with our user data. So let's try running this a second time. And even though I didn't return create user at the end, a user was still created with the first set of credentials that I provided. But now we can see all of the information within our user object.